French Revolution brought an end to an established government. It threw France into chaos, and it pushed Europe into war. But what were the events that led to this violent, transformative upheaval? Hi, I'm Rich Burnett for Wondrium, and in this episode of Perspectives, 3 historians walk us through the French Revolution. They'll start with its core tenets, and they move onward to its bloody conclusion. We begin now with a look at how French dissidents became enraged enough to change the world.
Beginning in 1789 and continuing for a full decade, the French Revolution didn't come out of nowhere. The century that preceded it brought new ideas, priorities, and politicized constituencies. The old regime had resisted these pressures for decades. And then a financial crisis married ineffective leadership with social unrest, and ideological challenges proved overwhelming. Louis XVI had come to the throne in 1774 and was the last of the Bourbon dynasty, the dynasty that had ruled France since 1589. The Bourbons enjoyed certain advantages that their English counterparts did not, whereas the English king and parliament battled for supremacy throughout the 17th century. French monarchs didn't have to contend with an independent legislature. Also, France had nothing analogous to England's Magna Carta or America's Bill of Rights. The French king was the law and the source of all authority. Under the king, 3 estates comprised the rest of society: the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate. The clergy, who were considered closest to God below the monarch, constituted the first estate. They numbered about 100,000 people out of a population of 25 million. The second estate encompassed the French nobility, numbering about 400,000. The third estate consisted of everyone else, from peasants to artisans and wealthy non-noble merchants. Privilege flowed down at the discretion of those on the higher rungs. But in time, a growing number of French intellectuals found the situation irrational and unjust, especially compared to the system of constitutional rule arising out of England's glorious revolution of 1688 and 1689. In a period of intellectual ferment known as the Enlightenment, extending roughly from 1715 to 1789, social critics published books and pamphlets detailing religious intolerance, social inequality, and the arbitrary rule of despots. Enlightenment figures such as Montesquieu, Diderot, Rousseau, and Voltaire ridiculed and derided these bedrocks of French society. Rumors, songs, jokes, pamphlets, and even pornography with a political theme reached a wide swath of the French population and normalized irreverence for institutions formerly held as sacrosanct. Such commentary was risky. Many dissident authors were jailed for challenging the political and social orders, and the bonds of loyalty that tethered the public to the old regime were gradually whittling away. Indeed, the doomed Louis XVI was the subject of ribald speculation from the moment he ascended the throne. For most of the first decade of his marriage to the Austrian princess Marie Antoinette, the royal couple failed to produce an heir, which was one of their most important obligations. As years passed, cartoons and illegal pamphlets lampooned Louis as impotent, both in and out of his bedroom. His wife was cast as an Austrian whore. By the time the first of their 4 children was born after 8 years of matrimony, the air of veneration that seemed requisite for monarchy had evaporated. Still, this wouldn't have been sufficient on its own to spark a revolution. Revolution required a matchstick. And that was to be the fallout from the American Revolution. A colonized people now proposed, with the rhetoric of liberty and equality, to throw off monarchical rule and introduce a new system of government. The Americans inspired many Frenchmen. At the same time, The French involvement in the American Revolution put an unsustainable strain on the French economy. French assistance came on top of reckless spending by the king and queen when growing numbers of subjects were struggling to cope with the drastically rising prices of basic goods, including bread. To make matters worse, a rigid feudal structure made the French clergy and nobility tax-exempt, leaving Louis with limited means to revive his depleted treasury. The monarch had no choice but to appeal to representatives of the higher orders for help. Instead of rubber stamping a new tax system, as Louis requested, the king's privileged subjects called for a meeting of an Estates General, a country-wide representative body that had last met in 1614. The hope was that through this national body, French elites could establish greater liberty and solvency while also making inroads against the monarch's absolutism. Brought to a heel, King Louis XVI agreed to convene the National Deliberative Body. The Parlement of Paris, the main law court, decreed that the Estates General would meet exactly as it had in 1614. Each estate would sit separately, and all votes would proceed by order. While the Third Estate would have a voice in national affairs, the deck was nevertheless still stacked in favor of the elites. The First and Second Estates formed a natural coalition, a sort of voting bloc or informal caucus that served as a perennial check on the Third Estate.
For the First and Second Estates, the clergy and the aristocracy, the smallness of their numbers did not mean merde. For a month, they refused to meet with the Third Estate as equals. Consequently, on June 17th of 1789, the representatives of the Third Estate, all 578 of them, declared themselves a National Assembly of the People tasked with creating a constitution. They invited the representatives from the First and Second Estates to join them or not. In essence, what the reps for the Third Estate did, along with a small but growing number of defectors from the First and Second Estates, was proclaimed that their National Assembly represented the French nation. Ecstatic messages of support for the self-proclaimed National Assembly poured into Paris from all over France. Of course, this went over with King Louis XVI and his people like the proverbial barbed wire jockstrap. That is, it didn't go over well at all. Even as the king revoked the National Assembly and its stinking plan to write a constitution, French soldiers, most of them foreign mercenaries, began to pour into Paris. Convinced that Louis and his government were about to crush the assembly by force, the mob took to the streets and rioting and looting broke out in Paris. The rioters, French patriots if you supported them, lawless thugs if you did not, needed weapons. So on July 14th, 1789, a mob attacked that symbol of royal authority, the Bastille fortress, which housed a substantial armory. Et alors, France exploded. Across France, civil authority crumbled like a week-old croissant. On July 17th, 1789, Louis XVI, having been abandoned by the sharp end of his monarchy, meaning the army, was forced to do the unthinkable. Hat in hand, he called on the assembly at its headquarters in Paris's Hôtel de Ville, City Hall, where he endured the ritual humiliation of putting on the circular red, white, and blue cockade, or badge of the revolution, and bowing his head in submission to his new masters in the National Assembly.
On August 4th, with a stroke of the pen, the National Assembly abolished the nation's traditional system of feudalism. The National Assembly now constituted a new center of national authority. And on August 27th, inspired by the Americans' Declaration of Independence, the National Assembly articulated its Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It made clear that men were born and remain free and equal in rights. In looking to establish a new relationship between the government and the governed, National Assembly delegates stressed that the aim of all political associations was to preserve rights to liberty, property, security, and to resist oppression. Moreover, sovereignty was to reside in the nation as constituted by its citizens. It would be difficult to overestimate the political or intellectual significance of this French declaration. It transformed the nation's people from subjects into citizens. UCLA historian Lynne contends that whatever form the new government might take once the Constitution was written, the Declaration of Rights made clear that the source of the government's legitimacy now flowed from its guarantee of individual rights. Still, France remained a monarchy in form, if not substance. In order for the Declaration of Rights to have the full weight of law, it had to be ratified by the king, and he hesitated. A few weeks later, Parisian commoners resolved to exert their sovereignty once more. Incensed by continuing shortages of bread and the king's unwillingness to endorse the August decrees, some 7,000 Parisian women, armed with swords, muskets, broomsticks, and pitchforks, marched on Versailles in October. Reinforced by several thousand male members of the self-appointed National Guard, the women compelled Louis XVI to sign the decrees ending feudalism and guaranteeing rights to man and citizen. In addition, the king and his family were forced to leave the royal residence and relocate to Paris's Tuileries Palace, where it was thought the common people could keep a better eye on them. Meanwhile, the National Assembly debated key notions about the future of France. And in September 1791, the Assembly unveiled a formal constitution. Absolute monarchy gave way to a constitutional monarchy. The monarch would rule in accordance with the law, and the law would be articulated by a body to be called the Legislative Assembly, elected by the citizens. Still, fundamental inequalities remained. You had to be a male property owner to be considered an active citizen with full political rights. The rest of the population, including women, servants, and the poor, enjoyed certain civil rights, but could not actively participate in the functions of government, including voting. This situation rankled many, especially a growing group of radical working-class men and women, known as the sans-culottes, literally those without breeches, since they wore long pants rather than the breeches and silk stockings of the well-to-do. Louis XVI added to their distrust in June 1791, with émigré aristocrats organizing counter-revolutionary forces on France's borders. The king and his family tried to join them. He never made it out of the country. Recognized in a small town close to the border, he was stripped of a disguise he'd adopted and returned to Paris in disgrace. Soon, the radicalization of the masses was also pushed along by foreign wars. Expecting an attack from the monarchies of Austria and Prussia, which were determined to halt the revolution, France launched a preemptive strike in April 1792 in a bid for self-preservation. Radical political figures and writers inflamed the situation. Journalists like Jean-Paul Marat warned the public that the government of France plotted against the well-being of the people. Marat argued that the revolution's enemies preached peace, confidence, and respect for the laws in order to prevent the explosion of the people's justified anger. Marat's predicted explosion came during the dog days of summer. News of strategic losses fueled anxieties about a foreign invasion and the fall of Paris itself. The rage of sans-culottes, who engaged in a daily struggle against inflation and food shortages and suspected their king and his Austrian wife of treachery, erupted on August 10th, 1792. Militant sans-culottes stormed the Tuileries Palace on August 10th, 1792. Royal and Swiss guards opened fire to stave off the rebels, but this made the sans-culottes still more determined. The royal guards were overwhelmed and slaughtered. The monarchy was overthrown. The Legislative Assembly tried to tone down the violence, but inflammatory figures such as Marat and the lawyer turned member of the Legislative Assembly, Maximilien Robespierre, denounced the calls for calm as counter-revolutionary. The tension that prevailed in Paris that summer led the new government to arrest thousands of aristocrats, former royal officials, and members of the clergy, whom it sensed could be party to a counter-revolution. As rumors swirled about imprisoned royalists and aristocrats conspiring with invading foreign armies, angry mobs stormed Parisian prisons and murdered some 1,200 prisoners, aristocrats, clergy, and common criminals in cold blood, in what became known as the September Massacres. Radical organizers and members of an outspoken political club known as the Jacobins, who included Marat, Robespierre, and Georges Danton, defended the violence. Marat said that if a mistaken humanity cripples the arms of revolution and holds back its blows, it will cost the lives of millions of our brothers. The discredited Legislative Assembly now gave way to a new, more democratic body called the National Convention. And with the monarchy overthrown, the National Convention declared France a republic. Within it, the radical Jacobin contingent drove the next phase of the revolution, calling for patriotism, sacrifice, and decisive action. Led by Robespierre and Danton, they believed that the French Republic was the vanguard of a crusade for universal liberty. The question of what to do with Louis XVI became one of the most divisive issues the newly established National Convention faced. One faction, the Girondists, espoused moderation. They wanted to put the issue to a people's referendum. But the Jacobins insisted on the king's execution. The most ardent and public proponent of the king's execution was Robespierre. His fiery, passionate rhetoric convinced a slight majority of the National Convention to support his efforts. In Robespierre's words, the king needed to die so that the patrie should be able to live. Momentum turned in the Jacobins' favor after a box of treacherous correspondence between the king and foreign courts was discovered in November 1792. The revolution now took a turn from which there was no return. And so, Citizen Capet, formerly Louis XVI, was guillotined in January 1793. This brought several other European states, including Britain, Spain, and Holland, into a state of war against France to stem the revolutionary tide. The National Convention formed a committee of public safety to deal with the existential threat from abroad and at home. It would function as a special tribunal to punish traitors, conspirators, and agitators. Riots rocked Paris in the spring and summer of 1793. As many as 80,000 people stormed the new national legislative body in June.
In 1793 and 1794, France endured a period sometimes called the Reign of Terror. Newly empowered rulers sought to find and punish anyone who had allegedly supported the old regime. Newly formed committees and tribunals considered charges against those who were branded as enemies of the new state. There was a sense in France that everything had been reset. The new revolutionary calendar restarted from year one. It renamed the months of the year according to the seasons, using in their stead French words for mist, frost, snow, rain, wind, flowers, and harvest. For example, what was formerly known as mid-July to mid-August was called thermidor, meaning heat. Mid-August into September was renamed fructidor, for fruit. New festivals were put in place in order to de-Christianize the country, as the Catholic Church, too, was viewed as tyrannical. Yet the system was not atheist. In the place of the Catholic God, the new order declared a cult of the supreme being. It declared nature as the priest, the universe as the temple, and virtue, happiness, universal brotherhood, and pure-heartedness as its highest values. Anyone found to be outside of virtue might be at risk for execution by guillotine.
Meanwhile, to deal with their foreign enemies, the convention instituted a general draft of unmarried, childless men between the ages of 18 and 25, bringing more than 700,000 men into the French military. They marched into battle with the defiant hymn of the newly composed La Marseillaise, the French national anthem, running through their heads. The anthem vowed to defend the fatherland in the name of liberty. In the winter of 1793 and 1794, the French did suppress significant domestic rebellions while pushing back the Austrians and containing the British. Some of Robespierre's colleagues argued that with the military situation improving, the terror should abate. Foremost among them was Georges Danton, perhaps the only other member of the Committee of Public Safety with as much political clout as Robespierre. But Robespierre refused to tolerate any hint of dissent. In early April 1794, the Dantonists, including Georges Danton, went to the guillotine. And in June 1794, the law of 22 Prairial was passed, denying accused persons of access to a legal defense. In addition, the law stipulated that there could be only two legitimate sentences for the accused: acquittal or death. As a result, the number of those guillotines soared, encompassing some 1,285 individuals in Paris over the next 7 weeks alone.
The use of the guillotine became almost commonplace during the terror. In the end, at least 17,000 people were tried and executed. Not everyone got a trial, whether fair or not. It's estimated that as many as 40,000 people were put to death. One source concludes that only 15% of that number were clergy and nobility. The rest were from the bourgeoisie, the petite bourgeoisie, the laborers, and the peasants, the classes that had initially banded together to seek political and social change.
After the French achieved a decisive victory against the Austrians that same month, ending a threat of invasion, many people expected an end to terror justified by the emergency of war. But that was not to be. Instead, weeks later, Robespierre denounced an unnamed group of traitors whom he accused of plotting a conspiracy. This was too much for members of the convention. Many of Robespierre's former colleagues and followers, having seen so many Frenchmen lose their heads to the guillotine, now turned against him before he could turn on them. On July 27, 1794, a battle broke out between Robespierre's supporters and National Guard troops, leaving Robespierre with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. But the anti-Robespierre forces prevailed. Robespierre was arrested and executed. And that proved to be a turning point in the revolution. It empowered a movement known as the Thermidorian Reaction, which divested the Committee of Public Safety of power and reauthorized the National Convention. Over the next few years, radicalism was expunged and violence was brought under control. The French Revolution, with its universal pledges of liberty, equality, and fraternity, transformed the modern era. but it came at quite the cost. Years later, the Soviet revolutionary poet Vladimir Mayakovsky observed that revolutions forcefully hurl their participants and a revolution's bystanders into the great unknown. So perhaps we shouldn't be surprised when revolutions grow violent and infused with terror. Maybe we should be surprised when they don't.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to learn more about the topics in this episode, the full list of series that these clips came from is in the description below. You can watch them all now on Wondrium.